Some good news today about the global pandemic. I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle now. And I know, Bill, that you have been intensely focused on finding the actual evidence that's out there and having discovered a lot of good news out there on your series that you've been doing every day now called the Coronasphere Lounge, which is visible at billwhittle.com. I unearthed a couple of other pieces here, some of which you may have already covered in your more in-depth programs, but I think we using this short form should give people some highlights.
Sure.
A couple of things that were interesting, I thought. First of all, today's breaking news is the stock market's rebound in the last 3 days. The S&P 500 now at a high, a 3-day increase that has not been seen since 1933. It's the biggest rally since then. Dow Jones Industrial Average actually up a little more, a higher percentage, 21.3% over the past 3 days. And today's jump in the stock markets comes after the news broke that there were some 3.28 million new jobless claims in this past week. Apparently, the stock market had already baked in a number like that and was not surprised by it. That in combination with the fact that the Congress is getting close to passing this $2.2 trillion relief bill seemed to buoy hopes on Wall Street. Bill, first of all, just kind of what do you think about I guess, how does the way the economy is going right now compare or contrast with what you might have thought would happen a week or two ago?
Things are to the degree that the stock market is rebounding, it's rebounding faster than I thought it would. But everything else seems to be more or less what I expected. The whole thing financially was clear to me. And as the president said from the beginning, this isn't a financial crisis. This is an act of God crisis. And it seems clear that the actions of the president have increased optimism. The spending bills increased optimism, and this is why I think it's so many of the criticisms of Donald Trump's handling of this, in terms of the sheer medicine point of view of it, is unfair. The case in point, of course, is him saying he'd like to see the economy reopened by Easter. He didn't say he was going to reopen the economy at Easter. He said he'd like to see it open by Easter. And the reason that this needs a little bit of analysis is because Donald Trump, unlike Dr. Fauci and all of the medical experts, has actually two jobs. He has two concerns. As I mentioned in one of our Chronosphere Lounge shows, he's got two timers running. One of them is the idea that the more you contain this virus with self-quarantine, the better it is in terms of lives saved, the more times it buys us and all the rest. But he also has an economic timer running. And the longer that the economy is in this kind of lockdown, the more we're going to see things that are short-term setbacks that companies can absorb become permanent, long-term setbacks. So for him to say that he'd like to see it back by then is giving people, including Wall Street, a sense of optimism and a sense that that there's an end to this at some point in the foreseeable future.
And by the way, Bill, today I just got done watching the president's briefing at the White House. Actually, I got done. He wasn't done yet, or at least the team wasn't done. But one of the things that he did was clarify that statement. And he said, look, that he would, as you said, like to have the country back in business by Easter. But that didn't mean that we wouldn't still observe things that we've been doing according to CDC guidelines, including social distancing, avoiding handshakes, staying home if you're sick, and all that kind of stuff.
Precisely correct. And the reason I think that he made a statement like that is not because he doesn't understand the threat or he's not aware of the science. Dr. Fauci has said that he's listened to everything that he said. The president's listened to everything that his advisors have said, takes it into consideration. But Donald Trump has two jobs. One job is to minimize the effects of this disease, and the other job is to make sure that people don't simply implode from despair, or most importantly, at least in terms of the economy. I think what he has to do is he has to maintain hope for the people who are struggling to keep businesses afloat, struggling to keep some sense of perspective against a number of reports that are basically saying, no, we're going to have to lock down the economy for 18 months. Be prepared to not go outside of your house for 18 months. And this kind of thing is is the kind of thing that I think he has to fight, and it's a tough balance, and I think he's actually doing a very good job of it.
Well, let me take that fact next, because that 18-month figure seems to have originated from a scientist, a British scientist, Niall Ferguson, who wrote a report from Imperial College in Britain that basically projected what would happen if we didn't observe some of these social distancing precautions and that lockdown for 18 months, so to speak, although that's probably not the correct term. He has recently given testimony dialing back some of his assumptions there, and it's unclear whether it's because he thinks his original projections were inaccurate or because the UK and the US have taken some of the precautions that were indicated by that. So now, instead of predicting some 500,000, 500,000 British deaths, he thinks now there'll be fewer than 20,000. And about half of those are people who would have died by the end of the year anyway. It's not clear how many of the 2.2 million projected U.S. deaths he thought would happen, but he's saying that hospital beds, ICU beds, would not be, in a short supply. There would be hotspots where there would be a great need, but in Britain, for example, there will be other areas where hospital beds were available and could be brought to bear on the situation. At one point, he said ICU bed demand would be 30 times the maximum supply. Now he's reasonably confident that their health system can take care of it, and with similar prognosis for the United States. And this is not to slam the scientist, Ferguson, but it does seem that the measures taken in combination with the potential inaccuracy of projections, as is always a possibility, Bill, that it may not be as dire a future for us as was initially assumed, even by people in the White House.
That was the opinion of Dr. Fauci and two other scientists in a journal of the New England Medical Journal that I saw just earlier today, just a few hours ago, that they are reassessing the severity of it and placing it closer towards an extremely virulent flu and further down than you would get from either SARS or MERS, which SARS had a mortality rate somewhere between 4 and 8%, and MERS was up to 30 or 40%, as I recall off the top of my head. Look, there's two things to say here. Number one, good news is good news, period. The second thing to say is that I had not realized how much of this was caused by one guy with one computer model. When he says he made a mistake on the severity of this, he's off by a factor of...
He's not saying he made a mistake. I want to be clear about that. He's not retracting. He's not apologizing or anything. He's
saying it's not spreading the way he thought it would.
His current assessment is a much less severe one than his previous one.
It appears to be 5% of his previous, it appears to be 1/20th of what he originally projected. That's not 8% off or 50% off. That's, that's an enormous difference. And people, look, again, sometimes it's so helpful to go to the extremes just to understand things that are on a spectrum, and the severity of this disease and the response to it is all part of a spectrum. So let's just take a look at the boundaries of the spectrum. There are some people who say the whole thing is a complete hoax. I think that's just clearly, absolutely not true. I don't think there's any question about that from a scientific point of view, that this was not a hoax or an exaggeration of regular flu-like symptoms or anything like that. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is where people have made worst-case projections based on the highest possible mortality numbers without even understanding the fundamentals that if you have 2 people out of 100 that die, you could say that's a 2% mortality number. But if it turns out that there's 1,000 people that actually have the disease and 900 of that 100 either weren't tested or don't even know, now you're down to 0.2% mortality. So the testing base was never known. And as we increase the number of people tested, we're starting to find that actually drives the mortality rate down. That's certainly good. And then much more importantly, I think, than this, became obvious to me, at least at least a week ago that the percentage of deaths, let me rephrase that, the mortality rate between what we were seeing in Italy and what we were seeing was in Germany was enormous. Couldn't possibly be explained by things like the relative health care measures, or the Italians like to hug and kiss and not so much the Germans. Way different. And what you find is that in Italy, if somebody had died of anything, and had tested positive for COVID-19, then it was listed as a COVID-19 mortality. In other words, if somebody had a heart attack and then they tested positive for COVID-19, that would be counted as a fatality due to the disease. The Germans, on the other hand, took what I think is a much more sensible approach and tried as best as they could to only count deaths that were directly attributable to this particular virus. And that's why their mortality numbers were far orders of magnitude smaller than what Italy was seeing. All of this stuff, in my mind, is of enormous significance. And I have to tell you, I just want to be clear on this, all of it, including the errors in the computer model, all of it. I give a pass to this, to virtually all of it, to all of the mistakes, with one exception. The fog of war is the fog of war, and outcomes after the fact that may seem blindingly obvious are not obvious at the time. The greatest military blunders in all of history had sound reasons for why they were committed. They just happened to be the wrong reasons, but it's not like I'm going to go out and make the biggest mistake in the history of man. So I have an enormous amount of respect for and acceptance of the fact that at the beginning of crises, in fact, not until the history is written, really, do we really have a clear idea of what mistakes were made and why they were made. So I'm ready to write a lot of passes for people in terms of we've got to make the most careful case we can and be as careful as we can, the social distancing, all of this stuff.
And people really do have kind of a mindset that is primitive cause and effect. Like we see something happen, we think it's associated with something else, therefore that caused this. And it seems to me in this situation with so many variables, I mean, I just got done listening to Victor Davis Hanson's The Second World Wars. And my view of World War II and how things played out has been radically transformed by what he talked about. But a lot of what he talked about was complexity. And I think there's a lot of complexity in this, as you point out. And that to leap to a conclusion and say, well, you know, the reason why it's growing in this country is because they do this, but they don't do that in the other country. By the way, just to get the latest figures, as of the day that we record this, the latest report is that the United States has more known cases of the novel coronavirus COVID-19 than any other country. That's some 81,321, the precision of which I call into question. But in any case, these are known cases, and some about 1,000 deaths as a result of that. And so
we don't know.
None of this show means to suggest that we are trivializing the impact or the results of this.
And nothing I'm saying here is an indication that it's all over, or that you should not do the social distancing, or that you should not have done the social distancing. So there's no question whatsoever that there's a virus out there that's killing people, and even no matter how much you measure it, it is a serious issue for people who are in high-risk conditions, or people of advanced age, and certain other individuals as well. I'm not saying that this is over. I'm not saying that the thing was a fake. None of that. I'm saying that the fog of war is the fog of war, and it's very, very difficult to understand things at the time. You make the best judgment you can, and so on. But I was going to say one case, but I think there are two cases here that are not just, that don't get a pass for me for unknown unknowns. The first one is the case of China. I don't blame China for the virus originating in China, despite the fact that these wet markets are pretty much perfect incubators of transmission of virus from animal hosts to human hosts. They're practically perfect for that, and everybody's known about it for quite a long time. So, but that's a cultural thing for them. It's not like, I don't blame them for having created this virus. I think they didn't create the virus. I can't really blame them for that. But what I can and do blame them for is their attitude towards the virus in the first month or two of this. There were weeks when they knew that this was transmittable by humans and absolutely denied it on a daily basis. They had laboratory samples ordered destroyed, which were destroyed because they didn't match the narrative that the Chinese Communist government was issuing. And the ability to have Western scientists there to help observe the results and help to contain this was just flatly rejected by the Chinese government. They continued to lie about it throughout the entire process. They're lying about it today. And the thing that's so heartbreaking about that is that China is, best guess, is 50 days ahead of the rest of the world in terms of this outbreak. They're claiming, hey, everything's great, everything's over, and opening up provinces. But we don't know whether those areas will be reinfected. We don't know. We just don't know. And the criminal aspect of this on the part of China is by not being open with the data, they have closed scientists' windows into the future. If they hadn't been so dishonest with the data and they were now saying, no, it looks like it's pretty much burned itself out, I'd be feeling a lot better about them saying that, but they've been lying the whole time. And that is unconscionable. That is not the kind of behavior that can be tolerated in an interconnected global society. And I think China's going to pay for it politically and economically. And I think the other party that bears real culpability is the media, particularly the American media. We've done a number of shows about the politicization of this virus and the criticism of the president, and worse than that, the invention of stories like how Dr. Fauci is at constant war with Donald Trump, and to the point where Dr. Fauci has to say, stop trying to tell this story that Trump doesn't listen to me and that we're battling each other. I'm advising him. He's listening to my advice. This whole thing is really quite unconscionable. So look, why don't we do what I've been trying to do during this Chronosphere Lounge show, and that is this. My entire goal from the start of the lockdown, I started this a week ago today, the daily shows, because while I was doing, as we record this on Thursday, while I was doing the Stratosphere Rounds last Thursday, we got the message as the show was going on that Gavin Newsom had basically locked down the whole state of California. So since then, what I've been trying to do is I've been trying to gather the good news that I could find out there with the ironclad understanding that whatever good news I was going to report was going to be well-sourced, it was going to be researched, it was going to be accurate, and it was going to have credibility. And furthermore, we weren't going to cover up any bad news either. But in the process of doing that, I find that there are so many things out there that we're mitigating and continue to be mitigating and hopeful that just simply aren't being covered out there by the press. And I can't help but ascribe a political, look, there's no question at all that to some degree, maybe to a very large degree, the media coverage of this has been driven by politics. And when you're talking about politics, politics is politics. But when you're talking about either life or death due to medical illness or life or death due to economic collapse, this was I think we will look back on this time, Scott, and we will say that this was the last chance that the media had to do anything with any credibility whatsoever. And now the latest polls are finding that across the nation, most people think the president's been doing a good job, and most people think that of all the players on the scene, the one that's doing the worst job by far is the media.
Let me give you two stories, one that I got from the media, one that was directly from a press release. And this will be really my final question, not so much a question, just asking for a reaction here. Two things that I thought were interesting. First of all, the SEIU, which is the Service Employees International Union, it's a service workers union, made some phone calls around to different vendors and found one source that had 39 million N95 masks available. So these are these masks that have allegedly been in short supply, or at least have been in short supply in pockets, places around the country.
39 million.
39 million of these masks, and they're about $5 a piece. And so they are now working on distributing those in a kind of a regional basis. The SEIU is not taking profits from these. They're just kind of connecting buyers with sellers to get those out. In addition, by making some phone calls, apparently, they found another manufacturer who can make 20 million new masks a week. And so they are immediately beginning to ramp up production. So that's one story. The second one, Bill, is James Dyson, the famous vacuum cleaner billionaire magnate, has apparently spent the last 10 days inventing a new ventilator called CoVent. It should be ready by early April, and there are already 10,000 orders of it from the UK. And he is just ramping it up so that it's apparently relatively simple to manufacture, can be done rapidly. Not only is the UK buying up about 10,000 of these ventilators, but he plans to donate 5,000 units of this ventilator, this new 10-day-old idea to help this global fight against the disease. And I just thought both of those were interesting examples of kind of, even though it was a union, sort of scrappy entrepreneurial activity of like, hey, let's see if we can figure out how to solve some of this.
3 days ago, we did a show featuring a good friend of mine named Brent Regan, who had been working on ventilators, on a pulse ventilator, and working very closely with Dr. Forrest Bird, who passed away recently, but who was the by far the leading expert on this. Virtually every ventilator at every hospital in the world today is a Bird unit, or at least a version of the ventilator that he designed to help people in severe respiratory distress. And Brent pointed out that this particular model had been in existence. It's a pulse ventilator, which means you don't have to be having trained ventilator technicians, because the problem with ventilation is, as Brent pointed out to me, that the amount of air pressure necessary to open up the alveoli, the little air sacs, is just a little, when they're filled with mucus, it's a little bit lower than the amount of air pressure needed to burst them. So you got to be careful with this. The pulse thing is far, far safer. And he said all of these components are off-the-shelf components. It's just, you just make them. They cost nothing, basically. Just manufacture them, crank them out. The problem is FDA approval. And so all of this good news, what the example that you gave with Dyson, and the example of Brent and all of these other people, the idea that you could take some of these anesthetic ventilators and convert them for use. There's talk about programmable CPAP machines, which are extremely common, having those things be turned into ventilators. All of this goes to the other part of the equation. It's a two-equation problem. We talk about flattening the curve because our healthcare system capacity is here. A normal pandemic spike with no intervention at all goes way up and down relatively fast, blows through the ability of our hospitals to deal with it, and causes an awful lot of damage, not just to people suffering from the disease, but if the hospitals are so completely overwhelmed with COVID-19 patients, then what are you going to do when people have heart attacks or other immediate critical surgery or needs or so on? So the social isolation has been designed to flatten the curve. It's been designed to actually extend the duration of the crisis, but to keep the peak down below our capability to deal with it in terms of medicine. When you talk about adding all of these ventilators, when you talk about finding masks, you're talking about the ability to keep the curve flat lower. When you talk about adding ventilators, you're talking about raising the bar. You're saying now we had this much capacity medically, now we have this much. All of these things are great news. If I had to look back on the situation so far, I would say that the two most hopeful pieces of news are the remarkable effects of drugs, primarily chloroxyquinine, or oxychloroquine, and that was one that just this regular common malarial drug seems to be very, very effective. And then the second thing that I thought was most hopeful, that hasn't gotten nearly as much publicity, but I did a show on this, I want to say 5 days ago now, where Johns Hopkins University, which to me is the unimpeachable source, it's the single unimpeachable source, issued a paper saying that they had compelling evidence that if you were to take a person who had recovered from the disease and then go down to any Red Cross facility to give blood where you would normally give blood. There are thousands of these places across the country. They do this every day. The blood cells are strained out centrifugally, I think, and that just leaves plasma. Plasma is that clear liquid that they inject into people. Plasma is probably one of the safest emergency medical procedures in the world. We give people plasma on a daily basis, thousands and thousands and thousands of times. Well, what Johns Hopkins found out was that if you take the blood of somebody who has recovered from COVID-19 and you take just their plasma, you leave their blood cells alone, you take just the plasma. It's not bringing blood cells, so it doesn't provoke an immune response. You don't have to blood type it the way you would with other blood transfusions. But amazingly enough, the antibodies that the person has created as a result of fighting that disease are capable of being transmitted through the plasma. And what that means is that if you've got somebody who's got the disease and is starting to approach a condition of severe complications, a simple transfusion injection of plasma, not a shot, but a infusion of plasma from somebody who has survived, provides flash immunity. We don't know how long that immunity would last. Might be a year, might be several months, but it's certainly long enough to get them out of distress. A vaccine is designed to get your body to create antibodies to recognize a pathogen. What this procedure that Johns Hopkins was talking about is better than a vaccine in the short term. Vaccines should give you long-term protection, but what Johns Hopkins is saying is you don't have to wait for this vaccine to start producing enough of your immune response to make the antibodies. You just get the antibodies right now, and they're just as effective. They just belong to somebody else. Somebody else created them. They said in that paper that one healthy person likely could treat 2 people who were infected, and since the survival rate is something on the order of 95%, probably much higher, that means that every single time there's a case we see the cases going through the ceiling, we see the deaths rising, but everybody who recovers, that number is increasing too.
And my understanding, Bill, just to be clear about this, and maybe you can counter or contradict this, but my understanding is that this idea is in the very early stages of testing. Very few people have been, but it's been approved for use in sort of mercy situations. So we don't have a large body of evidence for it right now, but things look hopeful.
We have a large body of evidence that it works. It's worked with other diseases. When I saw the report 5 days ago, they said that they are very, very confident that this is going to work. This, again, is Johns Hopkins University. Now, what's especially interesting and impressive to me is that at the time of this report 5 days ago, they said they are ready to submit their findings to the FDA right now and start working on the approval process. They said that would have taken years before. They said in the article, they said, how long do you think it'll take now? They said 2 to 3 weeks. That was 5 days ago. Yesterday, I heard that the process was approved. So it went from 2 to 3 weeks down to 3 days. I think the takeaway from all of this at this point in this crisis, and it is a crisis, the takeaway is that while we were certainly unprepared for something that we knew was coming across the world, everywhere, as tempting as it is to want to blame people for this, it is human nature, it's been built into human nature to not do anything about a looming threat until the threat appears. We knew the Japanese were building a fleet, and we waited till Pearl Harbor happened. We knew that terrorists were out there saying they're going to attack America, and we didn't do anything until 9/11 happened. This is just human nature, that's the way it is. But what I think is the thing that should give so many people not only hope, but optimism and pride, is the fact that from all over the world, unbelievably rapidly, I mean, really, Scott, in a matter of days, just days, reinforcements are coming from all points from all over the horizon. We're finding existing drugs that are very effective. We're finding techniques that we had thought might take years to test. No, they're undergoing trials right now. We're finding people who had never built a ventilator in their life can suddenly manufacture 10,000 of them in a week. We're finding situations where some of these masks that we thought were in such short supply are not only available somehow, we just missed them, but other companies are stepping up and they're saying, we'll make you 10 million of them a week. We're finding companies like Joann's Fabrics, which is basically an arts and crafts shop, a do-it-yourself shop, is issuing instructions on how to physically make, using materials that they supply, a virus-resistant mask. And most importantly, we have found that the people of the world, and the only ones I'm in close contact with are the ones in America, have voluntarily stepped up and have when I say voluntarily, I mean in virtually all cases, people are increasing their social distancing. But even in states like California, where emergency measures have given it the force of law, we're not seeing Humvees going down the streets with machine guns and having people either arrested or shot for mass lootings no, people are stepping up. And I think the final thing I'll say, and the thing is most impressive to me, is the attitude of just about everybody I see in America, everybody. The attitude I see is one of concern. We've never been here before. But people are not only, apparently the ones I see out there are not only cheerful, but they're aggressively cheerful. And there's a genuine willingness to undergo these hardships in order to make sure that we save as many lives as possible. And to the degree that good news is coming, and in terms of the response, and even better news in terms of a readjustment of the extent and the severity of the disease from epidemiologists, is more good news. And I think that the stock market rebound is an indication that everybody in this country understood that this was temporary, and we're going to make some sacrifices now, and we're going to go through some hardships now. And as soon as we can rebound, we will. The final thing I'll say about the final thing I'll say about the final thing I'll say is simply this. There is a danger now to want to say crisis is over or we've done what we can. I'm not entirely sure that is the way we should be thinking just yet.
Don't get
cocky,
kid.
I do certainly think, don't get cocky, kid. Yeah, don't get cocky.
So, ladies and gentlemen, you have stepped up as well. And I haven't told Bill this, but I have been monitoring new memberships at BillWhittle.com. And in the last couple of days, there's been a significant surge of those. We are grateful to the longstanding members who have stayed with us through good times and tougher times and have made it possible for us to produce this program. And we also welcome the many new people who are signing up and becoming members at BillWhittle.com. We are producing for you some backstage content that the non-members don't get to see. And you also have access to a member-written blog that you can author yourself, not just read it, but actually write it. And you have access to a comments section where you can engage in conversation and encouragement with some of the best people on the face of this planet. If you have not yet become one of those who have been part of this surge, you can go to BillWhittle.com and click that Become a Member link. As we mentioned the other day, YouTube's algorithm has really clamped down on a lot of the content, especially regarding the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm sure as a way to try to shut out the sort of dangerous kinds of information that could be going out there. But as a consequence, they've swept up us in their wake as well. And so we've probably seen a doubling or more of the number of our videos that are initially demonetized when that first surge of viewership comes in, which means that advertising dollars that otherwise would go to BillWhittle.com do not get there. You have stepped up. You are making a difference. You're making it possible for these messages to go around the world, and we're grateful for that. So for Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.